And welcome into the No Offseason Fantasy Pod. We are live here today, this morning. Hope that coffee, water, OJ, apple juice, whatever some of y'all drink in the morning. For me, it's coffee, right? Can't get all these stats going without some good old-fashioned caffeine for you. And, boy, do we have a slate for you today. Going to be covering all the games, each game one by one. I'm going to start with the noon slate first, work our way into the afternoon slate, and we'll talk about Sunday Night Football for a little bit as well. Not going to have a prop, most likely not going to have a prop bet live stream for Sunday Night Football. I usually do that for Monday and Thursday night, but right now, not going to do a Sunday night prop bet. But if you do have prop questions, please shoot them in the chat. I will stop, mid-preview for the game, and we can look through some prop bets and just see on hit rates, depending on what the line is. Just give me that question, and I will go ahead and answer it for you. That's what I'm here for. I am here to serve you. I am here to help you make money. I'm here to help you win your league. I'm just seeing that Denzel Mims is inactive again today. So not sure what the Jets plan on doing with Denzel Mims, but I imagine they should be trying to get rid of him, trade him. They've got Garrett Wilson, the top 10 pick. Obviously, that looks like it's going to pan out for him. Our preseason comparison to or for Garrett Wilson was Stephon Diggs, and boy, did he look like Stephon last weekend. The route running is just, it's there. The hands are nice and smooth. It's all there for Garrett Wilson. And I will let you know of any inactives that are important, fantasy relevant, anything of that nature. So, I said if the whiskey, water, coffee tastes great, I don't judge you. It is game day. It is about to be noon on the East Coast. Here in Central Texas, it's about to be 11 o'clock. So, yeah, if it's whiskey or beer, I don't judge you. Go ahead and get that can open. We're going to get started with the first game on the slate and a division rivalry between the New Orleans Saints at Carolina Panthers. Let's talk about some big stats going into this. This is the first time Michael Thomas is going up against the Carolina defense since 2019. And since 2017, he's had no less than 8 targets for those games. So, Michael Thomas, if you have him, you probably got him in the mid-round, 6th, 7th, 8th round, maybe the 9th if you got super lucky. You were absolutely firing this man up. No less than 8 targets since 2017, and of course he hasn't played them since 2019. He did not play them in 2020 before his second injury. What else? He's also, Michael Thomas, he's 13th in air yards. This is not his normal role for the New Orleans Saints. But they are using him a little bit more in a deep passing role. I believe that Chris Olave is helping opening that up for Michael Thomas. But this is certainly a very different role on top of him, being over the middle. Obviously, he's known for running a slant route. But 13th in air yards is not an accident. Jameis Winston is slinging it to Michael Thomas over the top. And so I imagine this might not be a huge bonanza or, high-scoring game of anything of that nature. But, Michael Thomas is still going to get his up against a division rival, and he's had no less than 8 targets doing so since 2017. So, all right, what about Carolina? They've allowed the 3rd least passing yards through these 2 weeks. Granted, they've only played up against Jacoby Brissett and Daniel Jones. All right, so we're going to take that statistic with a grain of salt. It doesn't mean that in a 2 QB league that you're benching Baker Mayfield, but if I have another option besides Baker, if I have another option besides Winston in a 2 QB league, you probably don't. Even in a redraft single QB league, you're probably leaning up on Winston. I don't blame you. You may have to do it, but Carolina is allowing the 3rd least passing yards in the league as of right now. So this is really going to be their first major test this season for that Carolina defense and secondary. They've also allowed the 2nd least fantasy points to quarterbacks. Carolina, that is, 2nd least fantasy points to quarterbacks through these 2 weeks. So, yeah, I'm not too excited about Winston, but you may have to start him, of course, in 2 QB leagues. In a single QB league, I am, not loving it. But if you have to start him, you got to start him. You know what I mean? If you had Dak or you had Lance and you lost them already, you may have to roll with Winston if you picked him up. You're definitely starting Michael Thomas. And, Olave is probably going to be a solid wide receiver 3, maybe a flex. So that takes care of it for the Saints at Panthers. For me, this is a noon kickoff here in Central Standard Time. 48.5 point in implied total points. And the Saints are currently a 2.5 point favorite. I would, even on the road, I'm going to take the Saints. They're 1-1 against the spread this season. The Panthers are 0-2 against the spread this season. So in terms of a betting standpoint, I will take the Saints to cover 2.5. I could see them winning by a field goal, maybe even a touchdown in that range. And 40.5 point total, I'm not touching that. Let's move on to the Bills and the Dolphins, and what I think is going to be an extremely fantasy relevant football game today at the early slate. Bills visiting Miami, and the Bills allow the least rushing yards in the entire league through these 2 weeks. They also allow the fourth least passing yards. Okay, so this is going to be a big test for Mike McDaniel, Tua, and the rest of the Dolphins offense. You are certainly benching your Miami running backs. Now, if that's all you've got, let me know what other options you have. But with the Bills defense, they look real. They've had, they've done well against, pretty solid teams, of course. The Rams didn't have that big of a rushing game, so you can take that with a grain of salt. But still, least rushing yards through the first 2 weeks of the NFL season. The Bills have done that, and the fourth least passing yards in the league through 2 weeks as well. But you're not benching Tyreek Hill, and you're not benching Jalen Waddle. No one is saying that, but it is going to be a test. Jordan Poyer is out for the Bills today, from what I understand, and recent reports coming out this morning. So that bodes well for the Dolphins offense. It bodes well for Tua. It bodes well for Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. So although this is going to be a tough matchup for the Miami offense, it's not going to be one where you're sitting these players. You're going to absolutely fire those puppies up. What else about the Dolphins? The Dolphins lead the league in passing yards, of course, after their, damn near 600-700 yard game with Tua last week against the Ravens in that great comeback in week 2. So, of course, after that, what does that mean for the Bills defense? For those of you who are still playing in dinosaur leagues who have defenses or DSTs, if there's going to be 1 week where I maybe pick up another defense and stash the Bills D for the rest of the season, this might be one, because this Mike McDaniel-led offense with Tua and Tyreek Hill, it looks legit, does it not? They slaughtered New England and Bill Belichick in the first week, and usually everyone knows Bill Belichick is really good about taking away your best player, and it didn't matter. Mike McDaniel just absolutely slaughtered the New England Patriots, and then, of course, what Miami did to the Ravens last week is very, very encouraging for this offense. So, if there is a week that I'm benching the Bills defense, it's this week. But I would not drop them. Wouldn't drop them. All right. The Bills are 5th in passing, of course. Stephon Diggs and that Josh Allen connection is just amazing. You're starting those guys. Gabe Davis, if he comes out okay, you're going to start him. I'm a little worried about him just because of his practicing schedule all week. But if he plays, you're going to start him. If he burns you, he burns you. But Gabe Davis is just a big play guy. You are not benching him. If you drafted him, in these first 6-7 rounds of your fantasy league, you're going to start him. You're not benching those types of dudes. And that, the first one that comes to mind is Kyle Pitts. You probably spent 2nd, 3rd round pick in auction. You probably spent top 3 tight end money there. So you're not benching those types of players. All right. So Bills are 5th in passing. And Diggs leads the league in air yards. And I think that's going to continue to happen. Air yards. We just see Josh Allen just floating it up to Gabe Davis and Diggs since week 1. And Diggs has 33 yards more through the air than whoever is in second, and that is Tyreek Hill, who is also in this game. If you're just stopping in, we're previewing all of the games for the morning slate all the way up until Sunday Night Football tonight. And I'm getting all these statistics in for you before kickoff here in about an hour. So we're going to be cranking these puppies out. All right, so again, Diggs leads the league in air yards. Tyreek Hill a close second with 33 yards away. So this should be a little bit of a bonanza, right? I have a feeling, both of these defenses are solid too. So this could definitely burn us in the long run in terms of thinking this is going to be a shootout. But Josh Allen, Miami defense, they allow the most rushing yards to quarterbacks so far this season. Of course, they played Lamar Jackson, so a lot of that has to play with that. But Josh Allen, just as good as a rusher, in my opinion, as Lamar Jackson. Maybe not as agile, maybe not as silky smooth or hard to bring down. But Josh Allen could go absolutely nuclear. I think this is a quarterback that you pay up for in DFS. If you're into DraftKings, if you're into FanDuel, again, because the Miami Dolphins giving up the most rushing yards to opposing quarterbacks through the first 2 weeks. So I could see Josh Allen going absolutely nuclear, even up against the solid secondary for the Miami Dolphins. And, of course, this game is being played in Miami. And let's look at the spread right now. I don't have it live, but as of last night, Buffalo is a 4.5-point favorite. That's going to be a close one. I think the Dolphins actually cover. I think if they lose, they probably lose by a field goal. And the implied total is 53 points as of last night. But what else is going on in this game here? Injuries. Jordan Phillips out on the defensive line, and the edge rusher, Ed Oliver for the Bills, are also out. So, this is a solid week. I think this is going to be the bonanza of the week. And Gabe Davis questionable. I haven't seen if he's been ruled out, anything of that nature. So if y'all see that, go ahead and please post that in the comments. Dawson Knox was also questionable. Jordan Poyer, who was previously questionable, now ruled out. And Teron Armstead, Xavier Howard were both listed as questionable going into this game as of yesterday, and I haven't seen if either one of them have been ruled out. But if Xavier Howard is out for Miami, you might want to just go for that Diggs, Josh Allen stack in DFS. All right, so we're going to move on from this game, and let's go ahead and move on to the Chiefs and the Colts. Major injuries. We have the rookie tackle, Raymond, for the Colts. He is out today. Questionable is Yannick Ngakoue, who obviously the prolific pass rusher, not doing so hot this season, but hey, still solid up there in that front seven for the Colts. The Colts, speaking of, they are somehow, some way, even after Matt Ryan's abysmal week 2, the Colts are still somehow top 10 in passing yards this season. I don't know how that works, but Michael Pittman coming back is going to be big for Matt Ryan. It's going to be big for that Colts offense. It's going to be huge for Jonathan Taylor. We saw Jonathan Taylor get, less than 10 touches, less than 10 opportunities last week. So, in my opinion, Michael Pittman coming back is going to be huge for everyone in this game, because also it's going to keep the Colts in the game, which is better for the Chiefs players as well. It's going to be a better game script there. So the Chiefs are top 10 in passing yards as well through week 2. Hey, that's just the Mahomes effect, right? The problem with that is, although they are top 8 in passing yards, who the hell is the wide receiver 1 in Kansas City? You're going to be top 8 in passing yards. That tells you everything that you need to know, that there is no clear wide receiver 1. Patrick Mahomes was telling the truth in the offseason and in the preseason when he said, sorry, fantasy players, there's not going to be a clear wide receiver 1. If I'm starting one, man, I hate to say this, but it's Juju Smith-Schuster. To me, he's still the alpha. He's not playing like it yet. As far as I know, Josh Gordon is active for today's game, for his first game in a long time. So we're going to see some Josh Gordon out there. We're going to see some Juju Smith-Schuster, Marcus Valdes-Scantling, Sky Moore. I think they're all going to get more heavily involved, just as they have been throughout this entire season. I don't think there's ever going to be a clear number 1 wide receiver, but if there is going to be one, it is most likely going to be Juju Smith-Schuster. The Chiefs are also allowing the absolute most fantasy points to opposing running backs in half PPR. This is exactly the situation that the Colts and Jonathan Taylor needed. This is going to be a big bounce-back game for Jonathan Taylor. So, it's not like you were going to bench him anyway, but it is encouraging that Jonathan Taylor going up against the defense who is allowing the most fantasy points to opposing running backs. All right, and who have the Chiefs played in terms of running backs? They've played James Conner, who got hurt, And then they played against Benjamin and Darrell Williams. So, I mean, not the best running backs. They also played against Austin Eckler and still giving up the most fantasy points. And most of that, that in that Eckler game against the Chiefs, as you know, in the fourth quarter, homeboy ended up cranking out the receptions till about 10 because Justin Herbert had that rib injury. So he was kind of dinking and dunking off to Austin Eckler. The Chiefs, allow the most running back receptions. So I think JT's going to eat. I think Nyheim Hines is going to eat. I think Nyheim Hines is a sneaky good play for DFS for both FanDuel, but mostly DraftKings, where it's full point per pass, for full point per reception, rather. The Colts also allow the fourth most fantasy points in half PPR to tight ends. Good bounce back game, good situation for Kelsey. This game could get ugly pretty quickly for the Colts. But I believe that their offense with Pittman coming back is going to keep them in the game at least within a touchdown. So the Chiefs will be having to play with their normal roster for the whole game, hopefully. So in terms of the Colts allowing the fourth most fantasy points to tight ends, I mean, they've only played the Texans and they play the Jaguars. So, I mean, Brevin Jordan and Evan Ingram, Dan Arnold, I mean, man, this Colts defense might be the one to target for your tight ends throughout the rest of this season because they're already giving up the fourth most fantasy points to tight ends like Evan Ingram and Brevin Jordan. So Kelsey should explode for you. If you want to spend up more in DFS for a tight end, Travis Kelsey is absolutely your man. Let's move on to the NFC North divisional game, where the Lions are going to be visiting the Vikings. Let me make sure I got my place for the next one here. Yeah, so, I mean, this matchup used to not have nearly as many fantasy-relevant players as they have before. But as of right now, I mean, DeAndre Swift, you're starting him up. TJ Hawkinson, as disappointing as he's been so far, you probably have to start him, right? Unless you traded him away, unless you were able to find someone else on the waiver wire that you feel more encouraged about. I mean, to me, Evan Ingram right now, I'm liking him probably a little bit more than TJ Hawkinson moving forward. So hopefully Hawkinson and Jared Goff can connect. Again, Jared Goff does love his tight ends, but so far not loving TJ Hawkinson as much as he used to love Tyler Higbee. Going to take a sip of coffee here. Lions are allowing the sixth most passing yards, even with the return of Jeff Okudah, their former top 3 pick in the draft just 2 years ago. So, I mean, Justin Jefferson, you're starting him up no matter what, but this bodes well for Adam Thielen to have a good bounce-back game, with the Lions allowing the 6th most passing yards against opposing offenses, and the Lions are also giving up the 3rd most rushing yards through 2 weeks. I'm sorry, they have the 3rd most rushing yards through 2 weeks. So DeAndre Swift just going to continue to eat. Don't have anything big on the Vikings. Like, this is not a massive matchup where DeAndre Swift is going to explode, but just with his volume in general, I've been a little worried about his volume. He's been extremely efficient, and I don't think that efficiency can stand up forever. I'm not saying he's a sell-high candidate, but you're really hoping that if you have Swift, you're really hoping that volume continues to grow, and you're hoping that they're just, not blowing teams out, because they clearly pull the leash on Swift a little sooner than you'd like to see, and Jamal Williams just gets heavily involved very, very quickly, especially at the goal line. And right now, the Lions are allowing the most fantasy points in half PPR per game to opposing running backs. So this is the time for Dalvin Cook to have a bounce-back game. I don't think this is going to be a shootout. I mean, normally when we see these NFC North teams play, it's usually not a huge shootout, at least not in recent time or recent memory. But this is the time for Dalvin Cook to bounce back when the Lions are allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. You've got to crank out Dalvin Cook. You paid running back one price for him, no matter the format, whether it's Dynasty, whether it's Redraft, whether it's DFS. I think DFS is a good sneaky play for Dalvin Cook today. I'm not sure what his price is right now, but it's got to be lower than it has been in the past 2 weeks as he's been struggling. But again, the Lions, solid matchup for Dalvin Cook and any running backs moving forward right now. And that leads us to Eagles Commanders here. There we go. Yeah. Eagles at Commanders. Another game where we have a lot of fantasy relevant players. Somehow, Carson Wentz sneaking himself in as a fantasy relevant player. He's number 4 in fantasy right now. Number 4 quarterback 4 in fantasy, and there's no denying it. They just look like a completely different team. He looks like a completely different player. He's spreading the ball around. It's not just consolidating all the targets to Terry McLaurin. He's involving the rookie Josh Dotson, who they traded up for in the draft. And so, when you see teams trade up for players like that, like Chris Olave, Jamison Williams, Jahan Dotson here in Washington, that means they're going to get these players heavily, heavily involved. Otherwise, what's the point of trading up for them, right? And so Carson Wentz is just keeping defenses on their toes, and the Eagles are allowing the 3rd most rushing yards in the league over these first 2 weeks. So Antonio Gibson, no matter what you think about Brian Robinson returning here in the next couple of weeks, they're saying he might be back by week 5, and he has to be back by week 5. That's the earliest because they put him on short-term IR. And so, yeah, you're starting up Antonio Gibson. Absolutely. 100%. Don't think about it. If he's your RB3 or RB2, that's fantastic. Fire him up. And the Eagles, for what it's worth, they've given up the 3rd most rushing yards to. They've played the Lions, so of course DeAndre Swift there, and then Dalvin Cook, who didn't have a fantastic game, but a solid game enough to where the Eagles allow the 3rd most rushing yards, which is crazy because usually the Eagles are pretty solid up front, not allowing that many rushing yards against opposing offenses. But so far this season, they're struggling. And the Washington Commanders allow the 2nd most fantasy points to running backs. So Miles Sanders here again has a chance at really proving himself because he's probably not going to re-sign with the Eagles here. But they've been giving him the ball a little bit more than they usually do over the last few seasons, and his talent is showing. He's being extremely efficient, probably more efficient than he's ever been. And this is a guy who's probably averaging 4.9 yards per carry since the start of his career. So Sanders is a must start. If he's your running back 2, running back 3, that's fantastic. Slot him into your flex. You will not regret it. And the Eagles are 2nd in rushing as well. Of course, Jalen Hurts has a big part of that, and so does Miles Sanders this year. So, what else for this game? And Washington is 2nd in passing yards. So we talked about Carson Wentz making himself fantasy relevant again. He looks like the 2017 Carson Wentz that we saw, who was, looking like he could have been an MVP candidate going into the playoffs, and then he tore his ACL within the last 2 weeks. Of course, Eagles ended up winning the Super Bowl that year with the help of Nick Foles. And so, this is a good game. You can't even think about Carson Wentz. He's QB4 on the year so far, just 2 weeks in. But still QB4, and Washington giving up the 2nd, or their 2nd in passing this season. So, I don't think he's going to go completely nuclear, but Carson Wentz is a must-start quarterback so far, and we're going to keep it that way. Don't second-guess yourself. Don't try to get too cute. If you got Carson Wentz, you got a pretty good value in round 12 or later this year, right? So let's now move on to an AFC matchup here, where we got the Baltimore Ravens going up against the Patriots at Gillette Stadium in Foxborough today. This is still a noon slate kickoff, and the Pats allow the 5th least rushing yards to opposing offenses. So, this is going to be Dobbins' first game back. If anyone is going to do well on the ground for the Ravens today, I'm assuming it's Lamar Jackson. Okay. J.K. Dobbins, I think that they're going to ease him into it, as they've had, obviously, through these first 2 weeks. Didn't feel confident enough to start him. Didn't feel confident enough to even put pads on him. This is the first time we're seeing him active in a game. So, sure, that's exciting if you are a J.K. Dobbins manager. But proceed with caution. Especially with the Patriots allowing the 5th least rushing yards in the league so far. And who have they played? You may say they played Chase Edmonds and Raheem Mostert. They played Miami, and then they also played Najee Harris. So, those aren't the worst running backs to go up against. Do we think that J.K. Dobbins or Mike Davis or Kenyon Drake are going to do any better than Chase Edmonds and Najee Harris? I don't think so. And for that reason, I'm out. I'm not playing J.K. Dobbins. I'm going to wait it a week. If he scores a touchdown, sure, it's going to look like he burns me. But, I mean, I think he's going to be on a snap count. They're obviously easing this guy into it. And I don't have their record in front of me. But, they lost last week. So they're going to ease it in with J.K. Dobbins because this is a team who can eventually contend. All right. What else? The Ravens have allowed the third most passing yards. They're one of 3 teams to allow over 800 passing yards this season already. And of course, a lot of that has to do with because they gave up 600 plus yards to Tua in week 2. But still, one of 3 teams that have allowed over 800 passing yards. One of those being the Pittsburgh Steelers, if I'm not mistaken. And they've played the Jets and the Dolphins. So, I mean, they're giving up, 800 passing yards to Joe Flacco and Tua Tagovailoa. Quite interesting there. Mac Jones is a must-start for this reason. If you've got him in a 2 QB league, go ahead and play him in that super flex spot. In redraft, if for some reason Mac Jones is your only quarterback and there's nothing else left on the waiver wire, I'm going to be okay with starting him. The Ravens are allowing the third most passing yards in the league so far, so I'm okay with it. I don't love it, but I like it. I like it enough. Also, Ravens allowing the absolute most, not the second most, not the third most, the most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Of course, most of that has to do with Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle going absolutely bonkers against them in week 2. So take that with a grain of salt. But Jacoby Myers is looking like he's not going to play. So, I mean, who are we looking at? Looking at Nelson Aguilar, Kendrick Bourne, maybe. If he's still on the team, let me pull up that depth chart real quick. Hunter Henry, Jonnu Smith, the running backs. I mean, Ramondre Stevenson might be a little bit more involved in the passing game with Jacoby Myers out. Jacoby Myers is an absolute target machine. I believe he's averaging more than 9 targets a game over this first 2-week span. So let's look at the New England depth chart to see who can step up with Jacoby Myers out for today's game. Devontae Parker, they brought him in the offseason from Miami. He's probably going to see a big jump. Kendrick Bourne plays on the right side, which is where Jacoby Myers usually lines up. Nelson Aguilar in the slot, and then Hunter Henry and Jonnu Smith. I mean, this is not exciting, guys. So if I'm picking someone who benefits the most out of Jacoby Myers being out, it's definitely Kendrick Bourne and Ramondre Stevenson and Devontae Parker kind of lingering in the back there. But I'm not excited to start any of those guys. I think Mac Jones is just going to spread it around. I think Mac Jones is going to be fine. But the wide receivers, I'm a little worried. But in DFS, got to take advantage of that. With Jacoby Myers being out, Kendrick Bourne, a big play guy, he's probably cheap. I would go ahead and start up Kendrick Bourne in DFS lineups today. And let's move on to the Bengals and the Jets. We're about halfway through the games now, and we are about 40 minutes away from kickoff. Weirdly enough, the Jets are third in passing in the entire league. Joe Flacco answering the question, is Joe Flacco elite? Overall, we don't know. This year, he's been elite. He's leading the Jets, and he's pacing the league. He's third in passing in the entire league. I'm not saying that the Jets have a decision to make when Zach Wilson returns, because they spent a top 2 pick on Zach Wilson. But, I mean, people might have some tongue-in-cheek comments about Zach Wilson immediately earning the job back once he returns by, I believe, week 5. So what else we got going on? So the Jets, third in passing. They played the Ravens and they played the Browns. I mean, the Ravens don't have a great secondary, but the Browns, Denzel Ward, Greg Newsome, they got a solid young secondary there. And the Jets still continuing to produce and crank out garbage time passing yards. And, of course, they allowed that big comeback by Joe Flacco last week. The Bengals allow the 5th least fantasy points to wide receivers through 2 weeks, and they've played up against the Steelers. I mean, Deontay Johnson, quite talented. George Pickens, of course, making that amazing catch last week. But they haven't played against amazing wide receivers yet. And now the Bengals are going to go up against and visit Garrett Wilson, Corey Davis. I mean, these guys have high air yard percentages. So this is going to be a big test for the Bengals defense. I think you have to start up Garrett Wilson because the Bengals are giving up so many fantasy points, so many yards to opposing wide receivers. And it's not really running backs. The Bengals are not really allowing that many rushing yards to running backs. I think Breece Hall is going to be fine. Michael Carter probably a running back 4, maybe a flex if you have to. But I would not go into the direction of Michael Carter because as we can see, as the Jets season moves on, they're leaning more and more on their second-round pick and the dynamic young running back in Breece Hall. So again, in terms of who you're starting, who you're sitting, I think Hayden Hurst is a fine tight end. He's a fine streamer if you're down a tight end for some reason. And you're going to start your Jets wide receivers. You're going to start them. Corey Davis, you're starting him. And Garrett Wilson, you're for sure starting him as well. And the Bengals, I mean, they're your studs. T. Higgins, Jamar Chase, of course, Joe Mixon, Joe Burrow. You're starting them. I didn't look into the Jets' pass rush. I don't know if they're all that intimidating at the front. So I don't know what kind of day this is going to be for Joe Burrow, but this needs to be a bounce-back game. I mean, the Bengals, after coming out of their Super Bowl appearance last year, they are now 0-2. They are struggling, and if they lose to the Jets, we're gonna have some serious questions come Monday morning across all media about whether Joe Burrow is the problem or if he is the solution for the Cincinnati Bengals. I think Joe Burrow's talented. I think he's still one of the top 5 quarterbacks in the league. The Bengals have spent a lot of assets and a lot of money on the offensive line this offseason, and they're still struggling to keep that man protected. So, yeah, there's a little bit of worry for Joe Burrow and the Bengals offense. But now let's move on to the Texans visiting Chicago at Soldier Field. And Chicago allowed the most rushing yards out of all teams going into Week 3. This is before Pittsburgh played on Thursday Night Football. So through 2 weeks, Chicago had allowed the most rushing yards against the 49ers, who are top 5 in rushing, and also Green Bay. So Aaron Jones obviously having that big game against the Bears. So take that with a grain of salt, but this could be a coming out party for Dameon Pierce. If Dameon Pierce is still cheap on, I would rather play Dameon Pierce on FanDuel rather than DraftKings because of the half-point PPR scoring. But this could be the coming out party for Dameon Pierce, as all of you who bought into the offseason hype and drafted him in the mid-rounds instead of him being like a double-digit round pick, you're hoping, right? So I think Dameon Pierce is a fine flex because of the matchup, and I do think he's talented. He's got some of the best vision out of all the rookie running backs coming into this draft class. But this is not someone I'm like rushing to start just because Chicago have allowed the most rushing yards to opposing running backs. Sorry, just the most rushing yards in general, okay? So the Texans have also allowed the 6th most passing yards through these 2 weeks. So you're looking at Mooney on your bench right now. And even with this matchup against the Texans and the young secondary with Derek Stingley, I still am not confident enough in playing Mooney, even in full PPR leagues. It's almost like you have to wait and see it for him to blow up. But I just feel like this is the game where Mooney's going to get finally like 8 targets. He's going to catch 5 of them, and he's going to have, 50, 60 yards. It's not going to be, a huge game for him. Wouldn't be surprised if he does just because of, how many passing yards the Texans are giving up. But this is his time to shine, just like Dalvin Cook. This is a matchup that Darnell Mooney cannot miss out on. This is a matchup that Justin Fields cannot miss out on. This is the Texans we're talking about here, who tied against the Colts. And this is just a struggling young team the Texans are, and Chicago, they just need to put it together. They really do. And the Texans, who have they given up the sixth most passing yards to? They played Indianapolis, so Matt Ryan in week 1, who had a solid game with Michael Pittman, and then Denver. So Russell Wilson, Matt Ryan, I mean, they're not the best quarterbacks right now, but that's who they've given up the sixth most passing yards to. So, I mean, the Texans' defense is not intimidating and not scary at all. Chicago is dead last in passing yards with 191. The second closest team is at 362. They're almost 200 passing yards away. This is why I'm telling you, like, even though this is a good matchup historically for the Bears and the wide receivers, I am not confident in starting Darnell Mooney until I see it. Okay, so Chicago allowing the third least fantasy points per game to tight ends so far through 2 weeks, but George Kittle was out week 1. They played the 49ers, so that was Ross Dwelly, and then they played Robert Tonyan just last week in week 2. So, I mean, is this defense really doing well against tight ends? Maybe, but they haven't really played against any big, talented tight ends yet. So, let's move on to the Raiders at the Titans in Nashville, Tennessee today. I believe this is the first game that we're discussing that is in the afternoon slate, so no longer on the noon slate. Going into week 3, the Titans have allowed the third most rushing yards to the New York Giants and the Buffalo Bills. A lot of that has to do with the quarterbacks rushing on these guys. Not sure what's going on defensively for the Titans. But that defense continuing to struggle. They're also allowing the fourth most fantasy points per game to running backs through these first 2 weeks. Of course, they've played Barkley, and then they've played the running back by committee for the Buffalo Bills. And the Titans are bottom 5 in passing yards. So this game could get ugly. Josh Jacobs is active today, but I would not be surprised. I think it's like a stomach bug or illness or some type, which if you've had, you know that's not fun, especially in a high-contact game like football. I mean, this... If I'm Josh Jacobs, do I really want to be out there while I have the bubble guts and I have to potentially go use the restroom mid-game? I think Zamir White is going to be more involved than he's ever been in the entire season. I'm not saying start him. I'm not saying play him in DFS. Josh Jacobs is the running back to play, and it's a solid matchup. It's a good matchup. If Josh Jacobs was out, then I would say Zamir White is a must-start, especially in DFS. But, again, Titans bottom 4 in fantasy points per game allowed to opposing running backs. So Josh Jacobs, fire him up, but he might still be capped as far as the amount of rushes he's going to get coming off of that illness. And the Raiders are allowing 14.7 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. But Austin Hooper is the tight end on the other side here today. Not excited about him. I don't think he's getting more than 6 targets a game. Yeah, this is not a matchup that, even though it bodes well for Austin Hooper, I am not excited to start him. I'm still going to bench Hooper, but would not be surprised if he has a solid outing today up against the Raiders. And time to move on to a division rivalry here between the Los Angeles Rams and the Arizona Cardinals. The Cardinals not looking good. Cliff Kingsbury not looking like a leader for this team, but the Cardinals are 5th in passing yards allowed, and they've played Patrick Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs, and they've played Derek Carr and the Las Vegas Raiders. Tyler freaking Higbee is a must start up against the Cardinals today. They allow the most, the Cardinals, that is, they allow the most fantasy points per game to tight ends. And who have they played? They've played Kelsey, and they've played Waller. Tyler Higbee is like here, and then Waller was like right here, and Kelsey's like way up here, right? But still, Higbee, second most targets among tight ends, behind only Mark Andrews going into week 3. So the Rams showing their hand. They're trying to get the tight end in Tyler Higbee involved, especially if the elbow is really bothering Matt Stafford. That could be why he's not targeting Allen Robinson or Cooper Kupp all that far downfield. So Tyler Higbee, heavily involved. Second most targets among all tight ends going into week 3. You got to fire him up. Absolutely got to fire him up. The Rams are dead last in rushing. You're not going to start the Cardinals' defense. They have been absolutely atrocious. But for what it's worth, they have Henderson, they have Akers. Akers got 15 carries last week. So, is this a step in the right direction in terms of choosing who the running back's going to be moving forward? I don't believe so. I still think this is going to be a committee of some sort. So the Rams, running backs are going to be quite frustrating for the remainder of the year. Ertz as well has a tough matchup here going up against the Los Angeles Rams, who are allowing a whopping 2.5 fantasy points per game through 2 weeks. And who have they played? They played Dawson Knox and the Buffalo Bills, and they played Kyle Pitts. So it might just be that the Rams are a super tough matchup against tight ends moving forward. If you have Ertz, though, you're likely starting him. He's had a few good games here and also great games last year with the Cardinals as well. So I'm not benching Ertz, but I'm also would not be surprised if he struggles today up against that Los Angeles Rams secondary. Marquise Brown and Dortch should have pretty solid games. You're going to start these guys. Dortch is, weirdly enough, he's a wide receiver 3 today because the Rams are allowing the second most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And, of course, they played Buffalo, so they gave up a lot of yards to Gabe Davis and Stephon Diggs in week 1. And then in week 2, they did play the Atlanta Falcons. So Drake London having a solid outing last week. So you are definitely firing up Marquise Brown. Rondale Moore is still out, so Dortch still steps in. I think he's going to be a solid wide receiver 3 for you this week. All right, time to move on to Green Bay Packers and the Buccaneers. So Packers visiting the Bucs in Tampa Bay. The Bucs are top 8 in rushing yards allowed. They're only allowing bottom 3 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. I don't care about that matchup. You're still going to start Aaron Jones. You're still going to start A.J. Dillon in your flex. The Bucs have played the Cowboys and they've played the Saints. So they played against a Zeke who doesn't look like the normal Zeke, especially with Tony Pollard getting a little more and more involved. And then Kamara got hurt last week. So, the Bucs haven't really been tested. They haven't seen a prolific backfield like the Packers with Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon. So I say start them up, but it could be a tough matchup for them. The Bucs are tied for the 3rd least passing yards allowed through 2 weeks, but they've only played against Cooper Rush and Jameis Winston. So, this is a tough matchup for Aaron Rodgers. So if I have other options besides Rodgers, who's been disappointing this year so far and doesn't have an identity in terms of who's his number one guy, Romeo Doubs, the rookie, Christian Watson, the rookie, Sammy Watkins is, I believe, out. So, I'm not sure who Aaron Rodgers is going to find confidence in, but I'm staying far and away from Aaron Rodgers this week. If he goes off, it's fine by me, but history says don't start him right now. Brady also going to struggle. It's good to pay attention to the inactives for this game. I don't have them right now, but for the Packers, it's going to be tough to see who's going to be that wide receiver 1 for them moving forward. Let's move on to Sunday Night Football, where the 49ers are visiting the Broncos in Denver. This is going to be a tough matchup for the Denver running backs, as the 49ers have allowed the 2nd least rushing yards to opposing offenses through 2 weeks. And, of course, they've played the Bears and the Seahawks. So take that with a grain of salt. This is a true test for the 49ers going up against, a solid backfield with Javonte Williams and Melvin Gordon. They've only played the Bears and the Seahawks so far. So, David Montgomery and Rashad Penny, not nearly as intimidating as Javonte Williams and Melvin Gordon. So this will be the first real test for the 49ers defense on Sunday Night Football tonight. 49ers also allowing the 3rd least fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. So Russell Wilson might be a sit tonight again, as the 49ers defense is quite stingy up against quarterbacks and passing yards. San Francisco is 4th in rushing yards so far on the season. You're still going to continue to play Jeff Wilson if you picked him up. You likely picked him up for a reason. You probably lost one of your running backs. So Jeff Wilson, a solid flex in my opinion, maybe even a low-end even a low-end running back too. And the Broncos are number 1 and allowing the least fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. So this is going to be a tough game for the backfield, but Jimmy Garoppolo now leading the 49ers. I believe they're going to try to run the ball as much as they can, even though they do trust Jimmy G. Jeff Wilson, a fine start, but he's going to struggle. This is going to be a tough matchup for him. And really the first major test for both of these teams moving forward. Last two games here. Jaguars at the Chargers at SoFi Stadium in Los Angeles today. This is on the afternoon slate. And the Jags allow the third least rushing yards so far. They played against Washington and they played against Indianapolis. So, I mean, the Jags holding Gibson and Jonathan Taylor to the third least rushing yards in the NFL over the last 2 weeks. So, Jonathan Taylor was pulled out just because the game was starting to get out of hand. I don't know what that's about. But this is going to be a tough test for Austin Ekeler, who's been struggling on the ground and been doing a little bit more of his production through the air. So I'm not saying you're sitting Austin Ekeler. What I'm saying is be careful with your expectations for Austin Ekeler today, as the Jags have allowed the third least rushing yards through these first 2 weeks. And also the Chargers are bottom 5 in rushing yards so far this season because Austin Ekeler is struggling. The Chargers have allowed the fourth least rushing yards as well. So these are both top 2 defenses going up against opposing running backs through these first 2 weeks. The Chargers, that is, and the Jags. So Jags allow the third least rushing yards. The Chargers allow the fourth least rushing yards. So a lot of this game might be through the air and not on the ground because these running backs have both been struggling. Both Travis Etienne, James Robinson been doing fine. But again, this is going to be a tough matchup for him going up against the Chargers, who allow the fourth least rushing yards so far. And the Chargers have played Josh Jacobs and the Raiders, and Clyde Edwards-Helaire and the Chiefs. So take that with what you will, but regardless, fourth least rushing yards in the league so far. The Chargers are 6th in passing yards so far in the league, but now with Justin Herbert playing through the pain if he's going to. So we're going to find out here pretty soon what's going to go on with Justin Herbert, but it might not be for another hour or two because they are in the afternoon slate. So, if you have a question about who you're starting over Herbert or over some of Herbert's wide receivers because you're waiting on that news, in my opinion, you're starting your studs anyway. You're starting your studs in this game. Don't think about it. Evan Ingram might be a solid play again. It looks like he's starting to earn the trust of the second-year quarterback in Trevor Lawrence. And I like what Doug Peterson is building out there in Jacksonville. I think that he's a great coach for Trevor Lawrence after coming off a horrible, horrible year with Urban Meyer, rather. Really, Lawrence had a solid season. It was just Urban Meyer in that offense there. So let's move on to the last game of the slate that I wish to talk about. And there's good reason why this is the last game I want to discuss because it's ugly. It's the Falcons visiting the Seahawks in Seattle. You're still probably sitting your running backs for Seattle, not confident about Rashad Penny, not confident yet about Kenneth Walker III. That neither one of them have a clear role. The Seahawks are never really in the game script to want to run the ball as much as they'd like to. But if you have Kenneth Walker and you're in a 14-team plus, you probably have to start him. The Falcons allowing the third most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. So DK Metcalf, a solid wide receiver 2, a solid flex. In my opinion, Tyler Lockett as well, same thing, probably a wide receiver 3, solid flex. You are not benching Tyler Lockett, and you're not benching DK Metcalf. The Falcons have played against the Saints and the Rams. So, they've gone up against some pretty solid wide receivers in Michael Thomas, Cooper Kupp, Chris Olave. I think DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett are going to be fine today. Geno Smith, probably a solid streaming option if you're still looking for someone to start in place of Trey Lance or Dak Prescott. Geno Smith, let me see here. The Falcons allowing the second most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks so far. So this is why I think Geno Smith is a fine play, even if you're not confident in him. Last thing on this game, Kyle Pitts. Look, you paid top 3 tight end price for Kyle Pitts most likely. All right, you probably took him in the first 3 rounds. I'm not panicking yet. It just doesn't look like Arthur Smith is looking to use him. He's about 1/3, 33% of the time lining up as a tight end, 33% in the slot, and another 33% lining up out wide. He's participating. He's running routes. Marcus Mariota and Arthur Smith, it doesn't look like they're trusting Kyle Pitts all that much. But it's not time to panic yet. This is a game in which I think he can be fine. He's just got to get more volume. He's got to get more targets. I don't buy the narrative that he's being used more as a blocker than he is a receiver. He's just not getting the looks that he should be getting. And, of course, other teams are going to force the rookie to beat them in Drake London. And last week that did happen. So maybe teams move their shift a little bit more toward Drake London, the 6'4" wide receiver, and move away from Kyle Pitts. So you are not sitting Pitts. You're going to start him no matter how nervous you are. And that wraps up this week's slate. We're about 15 minutes away from kickoff for the noon slate. We're about 15 minutes away for 7 hours of commercial-free football. And I appreciate you all for stopping in. This is all I have for you guys. I will still be on Twitter. If you all have questions, you can find me at the links below for Twitter and TikTok. I appreciate you guys coming in, and I will catch you guys on, Monday. Tomorrow night, we'll do prop bets for the Monday Night Showdown. And again, no Sunday Night Showdown prop bets, no stream for that tonight. So I will see you guys tomorrow about an hour before kickoff. Again, thank you so much for stopping by. Every like, every subscription means so much to me, and it means